Since the early 1900s, there have been numerous unexplained disappearances and deaths in national parks and wilderness areas. And in the absence of reasonable explanations, attention has turned to the possibility that these incidents may be connected to a large ape-like bipedal hominid, commonly referred to as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. In this video, we'll be examining a series of unresolved deaths and disappearances that seem to align with characteristics of possible animal attacks or abductions by an as yet unidentified creature. Lock the doors, hit those lights, and let's get going. Paul Fugate. Paul was a naturalist who answered visitor questions, curated exhibits, and compiled trail guides at Chiricahua National Monument in southwest Arizona. He was a controversial anti-authoritarian figure and was transferred to Arizona in 1970 due to issues with supervisors in his previous MPS job. Paul was also known for having an open marriage and had engaged in several extramarital affairs. However, none of these issues appeared to play any part in his vanishing without a trace on January 13, 1980. At the time of his disappearance, he was the only permanent staff member on duty at the monument. Around 2 p.m, he left the visitor center and went to check the trails leading to Faraway Ridge, a recently acquired 400-acre parcel of land within the monument. He left instructions with a seasonal employee, the only other staff member present, to begin shutting down operations if he wasn't back before 4:30 p.m. He did not intend to be gone for long and left his radio and keys behind in the ranger station. That weekend, another seasonal employee was staying with Paul, and when he didn't return that evening, she became concerned and alerted Ted Scott, the monument superintendent, and the pair set out to search for Paul. The following day, after finding no trace of him, a search and rescue team was dispatched. Every inch within a half-mile radius of the visitor center was searched, but no clues linked to Paul were found. The search continued for just over 2 weeks without resolution. The only solid lead came from an acquaintance of Paul, a guy called Dick Horton and his wife Joy. They reported seeing him on the afternoon of his disappearance, slumped unconscious between two men in a pickup truck while wearing his uniform. Under hypnosis, Horton provided further details about the truck and the men, but these claims were ultimately dismissed as they did not add up. Due to his complicated personal life, some theorized that Paul had staged his own disappearance. It was later revealed that one of his girlfriends was pregnant. However, a search of his home indicated that he had left behind all things he would have needed to start a new life, including his truck, wallet, and $300 in cash. Speculation also arose regarding the involvement of his wife Dodie, who was still married to Paul but lived apart from him. Some thought it odd that she did not visit the monument until 4 days after Paul's disappearance. Her residence was never searched, and she was not asked to provide an alibi. Other theories suggested that Paul might have been killed after witnessing an illegal drug deal, as the monument was known to be a haven for drug smugglers. However, there was no evidence to support this theory. The case went cold until 1983, when it was reported that Paul had been seen alive in Bend, Oregon. That same year, the Cochise County Sheriff's Office announced that Paul had been murdered and that arrests of more than one person were imminent. However, no one was ever charged and nothing came of the alleged lead. Over the years, various rewards have been offered for information regarding Paul's disappearance, but none have been claimed. With so few leads to investigate, many individuals began to consider alternative explanations for Paul's disappearance. His case seems to align with other mysterious vanishings, characterized by a complete lack of evidence, no blood, no torn clothing, and no scent trails for tracking dogs. This absence of clues pointed to an extraordinary possibility, an encounter with Bigfoot. After all, the National Monument is known for its dense, rugged rock forests and cave systems, environments that could potentially conceal unidentified cryptids. And with many Bigfoot sightings happening in the area, until proven otherwise, the Bigfoot theory remains a viable possibility for many. Albert Ostman. The vast majority of reported encounters with the elusive, large, hairy, human-like creatures sighted throughout the US involve passive observation. Witnesses who claim to have seen these creatures typically observe them from a distance, resulting in blurry visuals, and reports of direct physical contact with a Bigfoot are rare. But one notable case dates back to 1924, when Albert Ostman alleged that he was physically kidnapped by a family of Sasquatches and held for nearly a week. At the time, Ostman, a Swedish-born lumberman, had ventured into Toba Inlet on the British Columbia coast, opposite Vancouver Island, looking for gold. What happened to him during that adventure wasn't revealed until years after the event. In an interview, Ostman recalled that an old Indian he had hired as a guide during his trip warned him about something intriguing about the region. The guide told him of big people living in the mountains that had hair all over their bodies, were around 8 feet tall, but were not animals. Initially, Ostman brushed off the guide's story and continued with his solitary trip until he experienced 3 consecutive mornings of discovering that his campsite had been disturbed. Believing he was dealing with a troublesome animal, Ostman devised a plan to catch the intruder. On the 4th night, he climbed into his sleeping bag fully dressed and stored several of his canned provisions inside to prevent them from being stolen. However, this plan failed when he fell asleep, only to awaken to find that he had been picked up and carried off in his sleeping bag. Unable to free himself, he was moved up and down hills and through the woods for 3 hours. Eventually he was placed on the ground just as dawn was breaking, and that was when he first saw his captors, a family of Sasquatches. He described them as a family, an old man, an old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. Ostman recounted, "The boy and the girl seemed scared of me. The old lady didn't seem pleased about what the old man had brought home. But the old man was waving his arms and telling them all what he had in mind. They all left me then." Ostman shared his alleged Sasquatch encounter in the 1927 film Bigfoot, Man or Beast, released by American National Enterprises. He described how the matriarch of his Sasquatch family gathered food for their meals, gathering handfuls of grass, twigs, and various other plants and nuts. At one point, Ostman thought about taking the girl Sasquatch, who was friendlier than the others, back to civilization, saying, "I'm sure if I can get the old man out of the way, I could have easily brought this girl back with me, but what good would that have done? I would have to keep her in a cage for public display." Ostman relied on his own supplies for sustenance and noted that the Sasquatches made no attempt to harm him. He described how they communicated through gestures. After being held for 6 days by the family, Ostman managed to escape after the older male became violently ill after ingesting the contents of his snuff box. Quickly gathering his belongings, he escaped, firing a shot into the air to scare off the older woman, who tried to pursue him. He then wandered and camped in the woods until he managed to find his way back to a logging site. Ostman did not share this story until 1957, when reports of Sasquatch sightings started appearing in newspapers across the Pacific Northwest. He was cross-examined by the police, and he even signed a solemn declaration affirming the truth of his account under oath, in accordance with the Canadian Evidence Act. Until his death in 1975, Ostman continually told his story, never wavering from what he believed happened, and experts credited Ostman for providing the most detailed information ever on the mysterious creatures. But was it all a vivid dream, a hoax, or was Ostman actually telling the truth? What do you think? Bart Schleyer. Bart Schleyer was no ordinary outdoorsman. He was a trained scientist who worked for the Grizzly Bear Recovery Project in Yellowstone National Park during the 1980s before moving to Alaska. In Alaska, he supported himself by working part-time for a taxidermist in Wasilla, guiding big game hunts and spending months across the Bering Sea in Russia, where he helped save endangered Siberian tigers. He was one of the world's forefront experts in capturing, radio collaring, and tracking big cats. Highly skilled in his field, Schleyer was well aware of the dangers involved in his work. So when he vanished in September 2004, after flying into the remote Reed Lakes area of Canada's Yukon Territory, it raised serious concerns. Bart was very knowledgeable about survival and was well prepared for his northern adventure, having packed his gear into 3 plastic Action Packer crates, one for food, much of it canned, another for clothing, and a third for camp gear. He had enough supplies to last a couple of weeks, a good tent, a warm sleeping bag, ample gear, and an inflatable boat, which he planned to use for exploring the larger of the Reed Lakes. But soon after he set up camp, something went horribly wrong. After friends and family lost contact with Bart, the RCMP were notified, and investigators were sent out to look for him. They found his camp and found evidence he had eaten a meal. The rest of his food was still in containers, but his boat was gone. They later found the boat down the lake about half a mile away. However, there was no sign of Bart, and they considered the possibility that he might have hiked out to the highway. Given his physical fitness, it was plausible, but his friends and family were confident that if he had done so, he would have called someone to let them know. One of Bart's friends was dissatisfied with the limited search conducted by the RCMP and enlisted a pilot friend to investigate the situation themselves. At his camp, they discovered that Bart's tent had been knocked down and his gear was still present. Around the area, they found a backpack, bear spray, a VHF radio he used to communicate with aircraft, and a knife. The following day, they returned and focused their search around the area where the boat was found. That's when they located Bart's bow and arrows in a buckskin quiver, leaning against a tree next to a dry bag, which he had evidently been sitting on. As the men expanded their search around the bow and the seat, they found a camouflaged face mask with blood on it. At that point, they decided it was time to call the Mounties back. Investigators made a grim discovery. Along with items of clothing and a camera, they found part of a skull and several bones. The teeth in the skull allowed authorities to identify the remains of Bart. Unfortunately, very little of the rest of his body was found. This discovery immediately fueled speculation that Bart had been killed and eaten by a bear. Samples of bear and wolf scat were collected in the area, and while some bone fragments were found in some of the samples, oddly, there were no bits of fabric from Bart's clothes. If he had been eaten by a grizzly, there would have been significant amounts of fabric found in the scat. Other missing items from the search raised further doubts about the bear attack theory. The human remains were found in a separate patch of spruce. Bears typically bury their kills in what biologists refer to as a cache. However, Bart's bones were not cached, and there was no sign of this in the area. Additionally, there were no indications of a struggle, and his hat was completely unscathed. There would have been significant disturbance if Bart had been attacked by a bear, but there was nothing. Other theories were considered, including the possibility of a wolf attack, although such incidents are extremely rare, and there was no supporting evidence. Another possibility was that he may have experienced a natural death, with his body subsequently scavenged by animals. However, this seemed unlikely given Bart's excellent physical condition. What makes this case so unsettling, and why many pointed to Bigfoot, is that there were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a predator attack, and nothing that pointed to a conventional explanation. However, one detail stood out the most. His skull had been crushed with what investigators described as incredible force. What is most striking about this is the contrast. Bart was a man who captured man-eating predators for a living. He was not the type to panic or get caught off guard, and his friends and colleagues attested to the fact that nobody believed Bart could have ever been surprised by anything in the wilderness. Unless, of course, he was faced with something so terrifying that he had no chance of reacting or protecting himself. It's worth remembering that the Yukon is not just any stretch of wilderness. It's one of the most remote and least explored regions in North America, and has long been associated with Sasquatch sightings, reported by indigenous communities for generations. Bart's story, like all the cases we're featuring, does not fit neatly into an established narrative. It wasn't a bear attack, exposure, or simply getting lost. Whatever happened occurred quickly, and with a force unmatched by any known animal in the area. The complete absence of any signs of a struggle on the sensitive mossy ground, and the lack of tooth marks on his skull, have led some theorists, as well as close friends of Bart, to speculate that he may have been taken by something not of this world, or an undocumented apex predator, such as Bigfoot. Dennis Martin. We couldn't do this list without mentioning the perplexing disappearance of 6-year-old Dennis Martin, who disappeared on June 4th, 1969, while on a camping trip with his family in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. The Martin family were from Knoxville, but every Father's Day, Dennis, accompanied by his father, grandfather, and older brother, would visit the park for a few days. That weekend, they made the hike from Cades Cove to Russell Field, where they camped overnight. The following day, they journeyed to Spence Field near the Appalachian Trail, and planned to spend the night there. But everything changed when Dennis suddenly disappeared at around 4:30 p.m. His father William last spotted him running into the bushes to play a game of hide and seek. Dennis was with his brother and some other children from a nearby family who were also camping, and they planned to jump out and surprise the adults. However, Dennis never reappeared. After just 5 minutes had passed, the other children returned to the camp. Worried for his son's safety, William began searching for him, running along the trail for nearly 2 miles before stopping. He didn't believe that his 6-year-old son could have ventured much further on his own. Shortly afterwards, the National Park Service rangers were notified and a search was launched. Efforts involved the National Guard and the US Army Special Forces, but no trace of Dennis was recovered in the aftermath of his disappearance. It didn't help that the investigation was hindered by weather. A downpour broke out shortly after Dennis went missing, which caused streams to overflow and trails to wash out, and likely caused any potential clues to perish. As many as 1,400 individuals participated in the search, and although footprints were discovered, they were dismissed as belonging to a Boy Scout, who was also involved in the search effort. However, some people believe that the footprints might have belonged to Dennis. The tracks led to a stream and then disappeared. Notably, one foot was found to be bare, while the other was either in a trainer or an Oxford shoe, the latter being the type of shoe that Dennis was wearing when he disappeared. Search efforts were stopped after June 29th and officially closed on September 14th. The search for the missing 6-year-old was one of the largest in the history of the Smoky Mountains National Park. Following the disappearance, William offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to his son's whereabouts. In 1985, almost 2 decades after Dennis went missing, a ginseng harvester came forward and told authorities that he believed he'd seen the skeletal remains of a boy in Big Hollow, an area within the park. He said he'd actually seen the bones years earlier, but had been afraid to come forward in case he was prosecuted, as it is illegal to harvest ginseng in national parks. While investigators did examine the area pointed out to them by the man, they were unable to locate any human remains. Park officials believe it's most likely that Dennis wandered too far from camp and succumbed to elements or dangerous wildlife known to inhabit the area. However, many others point to a different explanation. Around the time that Dennis went missing, a tourist family miles away reported hearing a sickening scream and seeing a hairy, rough-looking man running through the woods, with something red slung over his shoulder, before getting into a white vehicle and speeding off. Dennis was wearing a red shirt when he went missing. Although the FBI determined that there was not enough evidence to link the two events together, noting the large distance between where the man was seen and where Dennis disappeared. The mention of a hairy-looking man fueled extensive internet speculation that a cryptid or feral human took the child, plucking him from the trail and travelling deep into the wilderness with the child in his arms, leaving behind no evidence of the abduction, because to this day, the fate of Dennis remains unknown. And given the complete lack of evidence supporting any other theory, is it possible that Bigfoot was responsible all along? What do you think? Danny Filippidis. On a snowy day in February 2018, Canadian firefighter Danny Filippidis disappeared from a ski slope in New York and mysteriously reappeared 6 days later at a California airport, with no memory of how he had travelled 2,500 miles across the country. You might be wondering how this is linked to Bigfoot, but we'll tell you. On February 7th, Danny was enjoying what should have been an ordinary day on the slopes. The 49-year-old firefighter from Toronto had travelled to Whiteface Mountain at Lake Placid in New York for his annual ski trip with co-workers. As an experienced skier, he looked forward to this yearly tradition. That afternoon, most of his friends decided to call it a day around 2:30 p.m. due to deteriorating weather conditions. However, Danny wanted to squeeze in a couple more runs before heading back and told his friends he would catch up with them later. However, when he failed to return, concern quickly mounted. A search of the area found his skis, along with his boots, passport, identification and car keys, but no sign of him. A massive search operation was launched immediately, but despite the area being busy, no one remembered seeing Danny, and the amount of snowfall made it almost impossible for him to travel any distance on foot. For 6 long days, the search continued without success. Not a single trace of Danny was discovered. No footprints, no clothing, and no evidence that he had ever been on that mountain. Authorities began to fear the worst, believing that if he was still on the mountain, he likely would not survive. But then something impossible happened. 6 days after his disappearance, Danny's wife received a phone call. The voice on the other end was groggy and confused, but she recognized it immediately. It was her missing husband. The call was traced to a rental car area in Sacramento International Airport in California, over 2,800 miles from where Danny had vanished. Authorities found him alone, still wearing the same ski clothes he had disappeared in. He appeared physically unharmed, but was clearly disorientated and confused. When investigators questioned him about his disappearance, he had no memory of how he had traveled from New York to California. The only thing he could recall was being dropped off by a big rig truck somewhere in Sacramento. After that, he remembered feeling compelled to get a haircut before purchasing an iPhone to call his wife. He could not recall the truck driver or what the truck looked like. Investigators thoroughly examined every aspect of his story for clues that might explain his disappearance and cross-country journey. They found nothing suspicious, and his medical records revealed no history of mental health issues or psychological problems. Physical examinations found no evidence of trauma significant enough to cause such extensive memory loss. Appeals to the public for information about Danny's journey yielded no results, and the mystery of where he had been remains completely unresolved to this day. The case attracted considerable attention from people trying to explain his impossible journey. Some proposed that he had experienced some sort of spontaneous teleportation, with his memory of the truck being his brain's attempt to create a logical explanation for an impossible event. Others suggest that he had been abducted by extraterrestrial beings, with the truck he remembered actually being a spacecraft. The case remains one of the most baffling disappearances and returns in recent history. Every logical explanation falls apart upon closer examination, leaving investigators and the public to wonder what really happened during those 6 lost days. With this in mind, we are brought back to the possibility that Danny was abducted by Bigfoot or some other unknown creature, and the experience was so traumatic that it wiped from his memory. This might seem like a stretch, but in all the cases we've discussed today, with no other leads to pursue, thinking outside the conventional box might be the only way to resolve these mysteries. While this one is definitely outside the box, it's called the Bigfoot time travel theory. Some suggest that Bigfoot can move through reality via portals and alternative timelines, which explains why the creatures vanish without leaving physical tracks or body remains. There are hundreds of stories and accounts, similar to the ones we've mentioned today, that do not fall into any category. Now, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago what I thought of this theory, I would have never believed it. But given what we know about the world right now, is it really out of the question to think that Bigfoot could be an interplanetary mythical creature? What do you think? I recommend everyone go for a walk in the woods today or tomorrow if they're able to do so, with Bigfoot in mind. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.